Cities across the world presently find themselves, I would pose, in the midst of a very particular moment of intense, specific, and yet highly differentiated transformation. A condition that's led some commentators, like OMA here in this image, to pose that the current moment has no idea how to negotiate the coexistence of radical change and radical stasis that is our future. I would argue, though, that far from having no idea, the present moment seems rather to be characterized by a plethora of ideas about urban change, both conflicting and complementary, which emerge from both the global north and the global south, as well as in networked spaces that exceed fixed spatial coordinates. Public spaces act as sites in which specific transformations can be imagined, materialized, imposed, and confronted. Such spaces therefore form the locale for an international network of practices and constitute points of intersection between people working together through collaborative means for shared ends. So through this presentation, I ambitiously will try to sketch a typology of those practices, necessarily incomplete, discuss their possibilities, their problematics, and perhaps the disciplinary exchanges that they inform and express. So close to home for me, as a PhD student at the School of Architecture at KTH, for the first kind of type, I would like to talk about a moment in architecture whereby architecture has attempted to grapple with public space, a moment characterized by the production of temporary structures for interaction, for critical discussion, and for enjoyment. This moment can, I believe, be explained on the grounds of what art critic Claire Bishop has posited as a return to the social, through which artists, or in this case architects, began to see their role in the 90s as that of devising social situations as a dematerialized, anti-market, politically engaged project to carry on the avant-garde call to make art a more vital part of life. So these practices that I rudely group under the same heading are based on a small group, a kind of clique, I would say, internationally, of architectural offices and collectives, but they share a certain presence in the gallery, a space which constitutes a site of reception for them as well as of finance. They share similar sites for production, often located in non-places, so infrastructural spaces, disused harbours, vacant plots in rundown areas. And they also engage with a strongly post-industrial aesthetic, built on the use of shipping containers, metal scaffolding, plywood boards, wooden pallets, and inflatable elements, amongst other staples. I'm sure that you're well aware of this genre. Disarmingly charming, relational architecture, as I've termed it, has been largely successful in creating cheap, functional, and aesthetically fun platforms for late-night discussions, impromptu lectures, community meetings, collective gardening, soup kitchens, cinema nights, you name it. And these projects have inserted themselves into existing contexts, often suggesting alternate modes of use in relation to the built environments. So in producing these kind of microtopias, to borrow Nicolas Bouillard's term, relational architecture acts in the same mode as relational arts. And therefore, I think it's important to raise some of the points of that well-developed critique. It should, for instance, be made clear that regimes of exclusion are at work here. It should be made clear that the use of post-industrial sites, as well as spaces that are very sensitive to gentrification, also needs to be carefully examined. This doesn't exclude these practices, but I believe that there's a series of questions that need to be raised in relation to them, including who takes part, what additional values are created, and how will that affect a given situation or sites, and importantly for me, what is left over once the party is done. So I would suggest that these are all critical in assessing this genre of architectural collaboration. One way out of that dilemma, perhaps the dilemma of the temporary, would be indicated by a shift in spatial scales. The paradigmatic examples of this shift perhaps would be the High Line in New York or Superkilen in Copenhagen. I term these relational infrastructures. They're public spaces that operate at the scale of the urban itself. The former project, that is High Line, in the genre of landscape urbanism that was raised earlier, tries to build upon a kind of ecological imagination of dynamic relationships and agencies of process. The latter, however, builds more upon a kind of vast space, perhaps comparable to Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's 1972 musings on Las Vegas and its commercial symbolism. Both constitute examples of massive public spaces created through complex collaborative arrangements. The High Line is generally lauded for its participatory process, whilst Superkilen has proved divisive, perhaps in a good way, I would argue. A third category that we might briefly add would be to move into away from the material towards the strategy. And here I would say this genre of work is prevalent in the American context particularly. So in New York, established artist Mary Miss adopted the medium of the vision statement as a planner myself, familiar with that format, and she suggested a strategy, the city is living laboratory, to link the arts with sustainability. Another example of working with strategy would be Candy Chang, who's a graphic designer, urban planner, and artist, in her Before I Die projects from 2011, where she worked towards putting together a toolkit for communities to deploy in reimagining their futures. So these strategies see artists taking on the role of consultants. In this complex game of art in corporate drag, the maintenance of democratic legitimacy, transparency, and accountability, I would argue, become critical, as art can begin to look an awful lot like business, even if it has a secret agenda. So finally, operating across a totally different register, a fourth category of work might be found in the production of relational networks. And here an example could lie in the Decolonizing Architecture Art Residency, DAAR, in Palestine, or the Institute for Provocation in Beijing, who both offer residency programs for artists and suggest work that takes as its starting point radical intercultural encounter. So rather, in the case of these two practices and many other working like them, rather than inserting convivial or pleasant spaces within existing structures, these practices produce new spaces, I would argue, spaces that refuse to reflect, and in that refusal offer alternatives to the distorted power conditions that characterize their respective sites. So coming to some kind of winding up moment, perhaps not a full conclusion, I would like to refer to the architectural theorist Sylvia Levine, who I am quite obsessed with and have mentioned a few times in this venue before. But writing about the interface between the disciplines of art and architecture, Sylvia Levine uses the act of kissing to describe a meeting of two mediums. As a model for explaining the collaborative project, kissing constitutes a powerful metaphor, suggesting as it does a moment within which the two parties, so in this case we could say the artist and the planner, the architect and the heritage advisor, the builder and the musician, are fleetingly carried away by a brief yet transformative shared experience. And in developing this theoretical point of view, Levine relies upon Swiss artist Pipilotti Rist's 2008 work, which projected idyllic, dreamlike scenes onto the interior surfaces of Taniguchi's MoMA in New York. But as Levine acknowledges, even if alienating and deforming, kissing cannot be critical. A critical kiss is a bite and not a kiss. Collaboration in the production of public space emerges then, I would say, as a matter of bites and kisses, a production of encounters that sometimes exceeds the purely convivial or pleasant meeting of the already acquainted or the surface niceties of the mingle. Collaborative projects bring about a clash of desires within their work processes. But importantly, they can also bring about a clash of desires amongst the users of the space that they produce. These projects then, and many that we've seen today as well, have the potential to perform, I would argue, the bites that are necessary in maintaining democracy in our cities in these times of radical change. Thank you.